shall we? Which side would you like to be on? Okay, good. Well, good afternoon, and it is my great privilege to welcome a friend of mine for some years. It's interesting that the secretary actually grew up in North Carolina, and after doing very well in school in all the obvious ways, ended up becoming a lawyer out of a New York legal system and so forth. And at some point, he felt the calling to go back. It's interesting, he became the youngest mayor of Charlotte in its history. And when he was mayor, he actually had a pretty big impact on economic growth because you foolishly became the mayor at the bottom of the recession. so you like, it's only going to go up. So because he turned out to be one of the most extraordinary mayors in America, President Obama appointed him Secretary of Transportation about a year and a half ago. And since then, the secretary has been spending his time basically figuring out how to get transportation working really, really well, all of the issues that we care about. What I like about the secretary is he's a real innovator. He actually cares about the stuff. He's pushing hard to do all the things to lead in our country. And I think, Mr. Secretary, I should just say welcome to Google.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you. Thanks for the welcome.
Okay, that's right. And for some reason, you're unveiling a 30-year program today at Google, which has not been around for 30 years. Tell us about your program.
Well, periodically, the Department of Transportation has put forth future outlooks, a comprehensive look at the future of transportation in our country. And I can't think of a better time, or frankly, a better place, because our country is facing some very, very significant headwinds when it comes to transportation, population growth, climate change. There's a number of factors. And if we don't get ahead of those challenges, we're going to find ourselves stuck in traffic for a long time. So rather than find ourselves stuck because we didn't look out far enough, our thought process is that we put these facts in front of the American public, and then we spend time working in Congress, working with state capitals and local communities, city halls, to figure out how we move forward. So the idea here is not to be prescriptive, it's to define the problem and let the solutions evolve organically.
So as part of this, you have to work with Congress, right? Now,
yes.
You were mayor. Now, give me that big smile. So as mayor, right? Mayor strikes me as a pretty good job, right? You know, you sort of, it's a defined model, you know, and you clearly care a lot about the people that you serve. Here, you have to get their approval.
Yes.
So what's your strategy for that?
Well, look, I think part of the strategy is changing the nature of the conversation. In Washington, there's so much conversation on surface transportation, for example, about the Highway Trust Fund and the fact that we have 4 more months of funding for it.
By the way, I did not know this until I was reading about it. The Highway Transportation Bill expires in May?
It expires in May.
What happens after that?
Well, what happens after that is that state governments across the country that depend on these dollars for highway funds will either slow or stop projects. That's essentially what's going to happen. Now, right now, the state departments of transportation are actually planning their plan of work for the year, and the construction season starts in about May. So if the funding runs out right when they're supposed to start, you can guess that there are going to be some problems. So it's a big issue. But the point is that we've been talking in Washington about getting the Highway Trust Fund replenished. Well, what does that get you? Well, what it gets you is budgeting to a number, but it doesn't help you budget to outcomes.
Got it.
And part of what we're trying to define in this plan are the types of problems that are going to impact the outcome. What are those problems? Number one, how we move. We're changing how we move in this country. As population starts to concentrate around metropolitan areas around the country, and you start to see more congestion increasing, travel times increasing, It has implications on how much money we need to invest, but also what it is we're paying for with that money. Multimodal systems are going to be needed in the future.
Multimodal meaning bus,
Yeah.
bus, car,
Yeah.
train.
Choices. Yeah, just giving people choices. How do we move things? Freight. We obviously have a lot of things moving around this country today by rail, by ship, by air. That's going to change. We're going to have a 60% increase in truck traffic, we estimate, over the next 30 years. We have technologies that I know folks are working on here and elsewhere on unmanned aircraft. There's lots of ways that we can attack the problem of how you move freight, but we need to figure it out and start creating the rules of the road. How do we adapt to changing weather patterns and climate change, building at a more resilient level? How do we integrate technology in our transportation system so that we can get more utilization out of what we have? And then finally, how do we align dollars and decision making so that we can achieve an optimum level of performance in our system?
I was actually struck in reading the report. The numbers are so much larger than I thought. America's population will grow by 70 million by 2045. These mega regions, as you identify them, will have 75% of U.S. population will be there. So this will become the defining. We think of America as a rural country, but in fact, it's going to be these mega regions that will define most people's experience. You're concerned about airline mergers and consolidation of hubs actually making the traffic at airports worse, right? For all the reasons that you could imagine. We have all of these issues about pipelines and goods and energy is in the wrong places. And you identify all these in the report. How will these issues get resolved in your judgment?
Well, the political system has to respond. That's part of it. But actually, the way that our transportation system works, the control is actually dispersed among levels of government. So, for instance, most of your bicycle and pedestrian facilities are developed at the local level, as are your transit systems. Your highway system is mostly state-driven. Your air traffic control system is actually run by the federal government, even though they're commercial providers that offer the airline service. And so we have this sort of Rorschach chart of control over our transportation system. And part of what the report points out is that in order to build the future that we probably want to have, which is one where travel times decline, you're able to get things and people move more quickly and safely, we're going to have more coordination. And that's going to mean not only the political solutions at the federal, state, and local levels, funding and policy, but it also means working very closely with the private sector to get it done.
So let's talk a little bit about the technological roadmap
Sure.
that you talk about this in the report, and you spent a fair amount of time at Google and some other tech companies trying to kind of understand that. And I think it's worth beginning by talking about autonomous cars and all of that. You and I today rode here in a car without a steering wheel, which is, to me, always a heart attack moment, and it worked just fine.
It did. My hair kind of stood up a little bit.
So I think our audience would probably say, when will I be in a self-driving car? When will I be in an autonomous car? When will the laws allow me? Do they allow it now? Right? There are all sorts of questions like that. What's the process you foresee? And let's pick cars, because everybody here is a driver. How does the car get smarter in your view?
Well, we have some things we're doing now to try to help. We're trying to set a regulatory framework for things like vehicle-to-vehicle technology. But the question that you're asking is actually one that I think is really important because, the vehicle-to-vehicle technology rule is estimated to take us 3 to 4 years to create. And the rate of change in technology could happen much more rapidly than that rule. And so what we have to do as governments, we have to work on 2 fronts. One, as technology is being incubated, we need to find ways to be at the table with the idea creators so that we can help you shape those technologies in ways that will actually gain faster approval into the marketplace. The other piece of it is that we've got to look at our own regulatory framework. And this is not only at the federal level, it's at the state and local levels too, to make sure that we're being as nimble and flexible and adaptive as we possibly can be, because that's what the future is demanding. The fact of the matter is our transportation system isn't the old creaky system that it used to be. It actually can be a very dynamic, innovative area, but if the regulatory system is too slow or too antiquated, we're going to lose opportunities to move forward.
So in Google's case, you're aware of our car activities, autonomous cars and so forth. Does the federal government support the drive? This is essentially regulated by the states, and the federal government supports what we're doing. What concerns do you have about what we're doing? In other words, what's the federal government's view of all of this initiatives?
Well, our main North Star on any new technology is safety. And as long as we're convinced that it's safe, first and foremost, I think we then are talking about how do we go through the process of getting it certified and out into the marketplace. From our perspective, I see a lot of promise for automation to do a lot of things that we care deeply about. Number one, we've seen an 80% reduction in fatalities and accidents in cars since 1960, mostly because
Can you repeat that? 80%?
80%.
80.
80%. Due in part to technology. Now, the technology was everything from the seat belt to, different lighting systems in cars and so forth. But we now believe that a lot of the reductions in fatalities and accidents that we take for granted today can be reduced with the adoption of technology. So we're bullish on technology, and part of the reason I'm here is because we're here to say that the Department of Transportation wants to lean in and try to get more automation deployed, but of course, we've got to do some homework on our end too.
Now, another area that you are responsible for, and I want to come back to infrastructure at the end of my questions, has to do with aviation and so forth. There's lots of questions with aviation. There's the free flight programs, there's the modernization of the FAA, there's the whole question of drones. So maybe let's start with the drone AUV question. What is the status of the law with respect to personal and professional use of drones, AUVs? What's legal, what's not? And then, as I understand it, you have a deadline to produce an answer to some other questions. Take us through the agency's view on all of this.
So currently, commercial use of unmanned aircraft is banned, absent an exemption. And so what the FAA has designed is an exemption process that on a case-by-case basis reviews applications that have come in, and we're seeing many of them come through. We've allowed exemptions, for example, in the movie industry for the use of unmanned aircraft. We also simultaneously have been working through the development of what we're calling a small unmanned aircraft rule that will provide a lot more flexibility for the commercial use of these devices, and that is work that's ongoing at DOT through the FAA and of course at the White House, and we're moving through that process as quickly as we can. We know the rules of the road need to be set so we can unleash this innovation.
And there's a deadline, right? The deadline is a year or two from now?
Well, we're hoping actually to do it sooner than that on the small UAS. Yeah.
And so small means what? What's small?
Well, we're defining mostly the height at which these vehicles can go, and I don't think it's a secret that we're talking more or less about 400 feet and below.
So think of it as ground to 400 feet would be reserved for or shared with these sorts of devices. Now, there's a lot of rumors in the aviation, and as you know, I'm a pilot, so lots of rumors in aviation about things. There's a rumor that for, I'm going to call them big UAVs, heavy ones, they're actually going to require something like a pilot's license. Is that on the table?
There is a discussion about how best to focus on the larger ones, and we've not developed an agency position. That is a discussion that is rich and robust and ongoing, but it becomes much more complicated when you're talking about larger scale vehicles that may compete at the same levels as other aircraft.
I see. So the question is, if I have a pilotless airplane, who is the pilot in the pilotless airplane, and the legal mechanisms, and are they above 400 feet?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you looked at some of our exemptions, some of them are ones in which the applicant is actually certified that someone with a pilot's license is going to be utilizing those aircraft.
So again, that's under the theory of maintaining separation.
Yes.
Right, because you don't want to hit these things. Now, if we go back to the FAA, there is, and you and I have spoken about this before, there has been a long-standing effort to modernize the air traffic control system. And,
Yes.
And I'll just say it's generally known that the computers were basically invented in the Stone Age, which is roughly the 1980s. And at Google, that's like they weren't alive.
Yes.
And there were discussions about vacuum tubes. I mean, we're talking about seriously primitive things. And you've inherited this structure. There are serious proposals how to modernize that. Where is that process? Is it funded? What are the steps? That kind of thing.
Frankly, we're talking about NextGen. The funding for NextGen has actually been below what was originally intended. And frankly, for a little while there, it was moving behind schedule. And when this administration started, the FAA actually recalibrated the schedule for NextGen. And despite the fact that we have less money to devote to it, we've actually managed to keep that schedule. And so most of the back office setup for NextGen has actually been put in place. We are now starting to roll out things like optimized profile descents. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it basically means that planes can glide down into a landing. And that is being used at the Houston airport. The Washington area airports are now using that system, and we're looking forward to rolling those out more around the country. But that is a next-gen type of strategy and tactic that we're starting to see happen out in the world.
Yeah, and the key decision there was to assume that GPS was highly reliable.
Yes.
GPS enables all of this.
Bigger picture, we have a 1940 radar system that has relatively imprecise tracking ability of our airplanes. And as a result of that, we have to have the airplanes flying at wider separations. When we get to more precise tracking of the airplane using GPS, we can actually move the airplanes closer together. We can do things like the optimized profile descents, and it saves huge amounts of fuel, saves huge amounts of time and money out of the system, and hopefully that will get passed on to consumers some too.
Well, the other thing is, if you go back to your 30-year report, you're pointing out that the crowding in these cities, those airports are inside those cities.
Absolutely.
So you're going to have even greater conflict over noise, use, and how do I get to the airport? All those kinds of things will become that.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask about the Highway Transportation Safety Agency, because that's an independent agency that reports into you. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how does that work? What are they telling you about the state of safety improvements? I mean, is there something interesting that they have? Are they more investigative?
Well, they both track safety trends, regulate mostly automobile companies and manufacturers. And they do track how we are doing when it comes to safety, and they give us suggestions from time to time on things we can do differently. The effort towards reducing distracted driving, for example, is one that NHTSA
That means I'm texting while I'm driving.
Texting while you're driving.
You don't recommend that anymore?
I don't recommend that, no. Although, interestingly, one of the capabilities NextGen will give us is the ability for pilots not to have an auditory communication with air traffic control, but actually to be texting. So it's okay to text while you're flying, but when you're driving, it's not a good idea. But anyway, we are starting to really focus in on how can we reduce fatalities in different ways going forward. And that's why technology plays such a big role here.
So I thought I'd ask my final question and then get to audience, and we're being broadcast all around, so we have lots of questions from around the world. I think the question that's on a lot of people's mind is, why is the infrastructure in America falling behind? And this is not a new problem. It's been going on for a very long time.
Yes.
But many people believe the infrastructure budgets, the spending, and I look at it and I think interest rates are at huge lows, right? The return on infrastructure, I think, would arguably be very high.
Yeah.
Think about the interstate highway system of the 50s and so forth. So this is, if you're going to spend money on infrastructure, this is a pretty good time to be doing it.
Yeah.
So why are we in this constant debate? And you mentioned earlier this expiration in May of funding, which is, I think, our tax. Sorry, that's all funded through a gas tax, right? So what's wrong here? Do we not care about infrastructure anymore?
I don't think that it's we don't care, and in fact, what I've noticed as I've talked to members of Congress is that on a bipartisan basis, people realize that we've got to do something. But it is a question of what that something is. And that is why this framework that we're introducing today is so important. The country has basically been riding on cruise control with our system for quite a while. And the highway system that was substantially completed in 1992, the expectation was, well, we've got that done, we're ready to move on to the next thing. The air traffic control system has basically been the same since World War II. And meanwhile, the rate of change in terms of where people are moving, how people are choosing to live more closely into metro areas as opposed to rural areas, which is different than it was 40 years ago. All of these changes are happening, and our system is basically static. And the debates we have about funding are really debates about trying to get to last year's funding as opposed to looking out for a longer window and working your way backwards to result-oriented investments. So I think that the will is still there. Folks who are stuck in traffic right now, someplace in the country, certainly want to see a solution happen. But I think the problem is that no one knows what the next thing is. And I think that when we talk about the trends in this report, it gives people a window that, we can actually choose the future. Just like the folks who said, the airplane can actually work. Folks probably thought they were crazy when the air traffic system was first established, but it's been a huge return on investment to this country, and I think those technology innovations are out there in the offing.
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
So let me just remind our audience that this is it's on the record, and there are members of the press in attendance, and we have a couple microphones here for people's questions on this or on anything else. I'll ask you the first question, which was submitted. We have an internal system which asks questions, which is, quote, why is the quality, convenience, and affordability of public transport in the U.S. so far behind developed countries in Asia and Europe?
Well, let's see. Let me try to answer this in very plain English. The first reason is that much of the responsibility for planning public transportation comes at the local level. So in highly congested parts of the country where folks are flummoxed by the amount of just pure automobile traffic, they tend to figure out that they need to come up with some other options, and that's how transit agencies really get going. But we don't control whether a community decides to invest in transit or not. That's a local decision. So that's one thing. Secondly, we spend out of the Highway Trust Fund about 20% of the dollars in public transit. And that has to pick up not only urban transit, but also rural transit as well. So it has to pick up everything that we invest in fundamentally. That's also a challenge when you have a country that is increasingly more concentrated in more highly congested places. The third piece is that in terms of how public transportation becomes necessary, there is a growing recognition that land use plays a role in that congestion that we're talking about. And when you have vertical, dense development, you have a greater need for that kind of transit investment than you do when you have kind of sprawl greenfield growth, where growth is more dispersed and it's harder to connect those assets.
It just seems to me that when these cities were built, somehow they were willing to build the subways, and
Yes.
now you can't get a subway built. Right.
It's almost impossible.
And there's something about the cities which need the most amount of infrastructure building, for whatever internal political reasons, can't do it. Now, you match 90% of the money in many cases?
For transit, we will usually match somewhere around 50%, maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower. For highways, it ranges depending on the different state. And I think in California, you all are about 80 or 90% local and state funding versus 10 to 20% federal.
So money may be the other issue, because as you know, as a mayor, getting money for this sort of stuff is hard to get.
Sure.
Next question is, and you'll hear a theme from Googlers about where Google operates. The popularity and scale of the Google buses highlights a severe shortage of public transportation. What can and should be done for non-car-based transportation solutions? If everyone on 101 was taking a bus, there would be a bus every few seconds. And for your background, I believe we operate the largest private bus system in America in terms of the number of people that we move, and it's the only way to deal with the fact that we want our employees roughly here and in a couple of other locations, and they're spread out. Yeah. And it's been a huge success. The buses are, you have to use your badge to get in. They have, of course, very high-speed networking in them, and people work on the bus.
Well, look, congestion sort of forces folks to think about different options, and the importance of having those options available can't be underscored. I think public transportation, public transit is one of those answers, but I don't think it's the only answer. I think there are other types of uses that can be employed. If you had a shorter distance to go from, for instance, the Bay Area to here, you might have a bicycle path that got people here. We're seeing that kind of thing happen in some regions of the country where bike is actually the way people commute. So we need to use all of the system, all the different ways you can get around.
The next question is so aggressive, I have to ask it to you before we get the audience's
I can't
question. Welcome to Google. Acela Express, Boston to Washington, 456 miles in 7 hours. TGV, Paris to Marseille, 536 miles in 3 hours, 7 hours in 1962. Is Joe Biden the only one who loves trains in Washington?
I'm glad you know that Joe Biden loves trains. I'm going to go tell him that you all know he loves trains. I'm a little hurt that you don't know that I love trains too. I love trains. But, you know, look, we have in our country with the Northeast Corridor, I'm told that there are 3 turns on the Northeast Corridor that if you could straighten would enable us to run at much higher speeds than we do today. I don't know if we could get to 500 miles, but certainly appreciably more than we can. And the reason why that is tough is because you have very expensive real estate that surrounds that corridor. So it could cost, you know, anywhere, it could be billions of dollars just to acquire the right of way to make that change. But the point here is this. I do think we're going to see high-speed rail happen in this country. You're going to see it happen right here in this area. I'm seeing some activity in Texas and in Florida that encourages me that this is going to be something that's going to happen in this country, and hopefully we can get it all connected together over time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I work on self-driving cars, but I'm concerned about much simpler ways of getting around.
Sure.
And it seems like a lot of governments deliberately or inadvertently discourage pedestrians and other means of transport. And, you know, 2 examples, LA did a study a while back that found a correlation between crosswalks and pedestrian fatalities. So they instituted a policy of getting rid of crosswalks, which seems a little backwards.
Really?
Also, I got here by electric skateboard, which is technically illegal in California due to a law from the 80s. And in general, I know a lot of people who take their kids to school by car, even though it's a few blocks away. I think there could be a lot of benefit by people using their legs and, you know, getting places without cars. Is there a role for the federal government to prevent local governments from discouraging pedestrians? And, you know, would you like to do that?
I think bicycle, pedestrian work is incredibly important for the Department of Transportation to engage in. And it's been actually one of the things I brought from being a mayor. As I was leaving my city to come to Washington, we actually were experiencing an uptick in pedestrian and bicycle deaths. And it's a passion of mine to try to make the world safer for folks that are walking and biking. What can we do at the federal level? A couple of things. Number one, we have the ability to pull together best practices and help local communities that are spending probably 70% of the dollars that are invested in pedestrian and bicycle assets even better, so that they're using the collective knowledge around the country to make those investments. We also are engaging in an information exchange with America's mayors. I launched an effort to challenge America's mayors to focus on this, and we're serious about it, and I think we're going to get some good work done. Your question about that skateboard and the rules gets back to a point I was making earlier, which is that I do think we have to look at our own rule and regulation processes at the federal, state, and local levels and look at the country we're walking into and focus a little less on the country that we had 20 or 30 years ago. It was a great country then. It's going to be a great country in the future, but it is changing, and we have to change with it. And by the way, my kid would love that skateboard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi there. I have a question about apps like Uber and Lyft, some of these ride-sharing technologies. Like, what are your thoughts on how this is going to play out in the next 30 years that you've kind of laid out in this plan?
You know, I think those companies are introducing a disruptive force in conventional ride sharing through taxis. It may turn out that it's like FedEx and UPS have been to the United States Postal Service and providing a level of competition that starts to change the conventional industry in productive ways. There's still some issues that have to be addressed and will be addressed at the state and local levels around how Uber and Lyft integrate with the rest of the system. But I'm encouraged to see entrants coming into the transportation space, introducing new ideas, finding new ways to put people to work and grow the economy. It's really, really neat.
What's interesting is that, and in disclosure, Google is a part owner of Uber.
Oh, I take it all back.
Uber actually has a pitch where
Didn't
they
know
talk about reducing the number of cars on the road
Yeah.
by virtue of ride sharing and so forth. So I'm still sort of depressed about the math in your report,
Yeah.
about this infrastructure, I'm going to call it a deficit.
Yeah.
Uber and Lyft are a mechanism to make it better.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So the more we use electronics in highways for things like tolling, the harder they become to use for visitors. Each region has its, different regions have different systems, and as a visitor from outside the region, there are certain roads and lanes that I cannot take at all in many cases. How is that not a barrier to interstate commerce?
Well, look, this is getting back into the fact that most of our road systems are state-based. And you could see, and probably do see, situations where a given tollway system that's used in one state may not work as well in another state or at all. Sure, there are challenges that that poses to people who are passing through but who don't happen to live in that particular state. But a lot of these systems are really developed for people who use those systems every day as opposed to folks that are traveling from some other place to some other place. I think this is a question that currently has to be addressed at the state level, not necessarily at the federal level. But I think it also speaks to the fact that there are areas that we talk about in this report that probably do need greater federal attention. One of them happens to be our freight system and having a real set of national goals around freight that states and local governments help us actualize.
This is truck freight or rail freight?
Both, all of it, because all of it is sort of interdependent. And in order to make it all work seamlessly and to realize the potential of this century, we're going to have to make our freight systems work more seamlessly.
Okay. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Given the reality of limited funding available at all levels of government, what role should the private sector play in funding major capital improvements for public infrastructure? For instance, bringing light rail to this area, North Bayshore, or capacity improvements for Caltrain. And what should the government incentivize public investment private investment in public infrastructure?
Look, I think there's a bright future for public-private partnerships in transportation. And it has to be part of what we add to the the use of tools that we have available to deal with the infrastructure deficit that Eric was talking about. Candidly, not every project is going to be one the private sector is going to want to finance. And the most important distinction here is to realize that for most of our grandparents and parents' generation, infrastructure was basically funded by government, funded. And there's a difference between funding and financing. So whatever projects we come up with that obtain private funding have to have some revenue that spins off to repay that investment. And that's why we'll see a small number of projects actually be attractive to the private sector, but they will likely be large-scale projects that spin off some type of revenue. Ports are an area where there are a lot of public-private partnership opportunities. Highways to some extent, and we're even seeing some activity around high-speed rail in Florida and Texas that looks promising.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So in certain cities in China, the congestion has become so bad that the city is forced to limit the amount of cars the residents can buy. They have to go through a lottery system now in some cities if they want to buy a car. Going to the future for the states, do you think, with 70 more million people and more concentrated in the urban areas, do you think the U.S. solution for finding decreasing congestions might have to be somewhat more restrictive as well? And whether that be a local or a federal level?
It's really interesting. I doubt we'll get to a point where the American public will want to limit the acquisition of vehicles in that way.
Right.
But what we are seeing with the younger generation, the millennials, is a trend towards fewer of them actually buying a car, more of them moving into these densely populated metro areas, making use of bicycle and pedestrian facilities, and more of them using rideshare as a way of making the trip to the grocery store or what have you. This generation is an important generation because there are more millennials today in the country than there are boomers. So it is a big group, and they're going to be driving the market in a lot of ways. And if their activities today are a portent of the future, it may mean that folks are just choosing not to buy as many cars in the future.
Well, speaking as a boomer,
Yeah.
right, it goes downhill from here. These millennials, just more and more of them and fewer and fewer of us. But let me push you on this, because one of our employees says, what's your stance on using policy to decrease urban sprawl, an arguably outdated model that contributes greatly to climate change? I mean, how far should the government go? I mean, your answer so far has been, the reality is that a lot of this stuff is done at the state and civic level. Do you think that you and the federal government should take a tougher line on this, given it's such a massive issue?
I think that the federal government's best place here is to have programs that are flexible enough to help communities that are grappling with this problem in smart ways. Okay. So one of the things, we introduced some legislation last year. Today, the president announced his budget contains a 6-year transportation funding approach that will substantially increase the amount of money in public transit, for instance, so that we can build for the future and deal with this problem. I do want to say, though, that at the local level, there's a real important imperative to connect transportation and land use. In other words, if we build another highway lane to manage the capacity that exists today, and then the local government then zones in twice the population in there, guess what's going to happen to that extra lane mile? It's going to get recongested.
Well, in fact, there's an interesting statistics in traffic studies that that whenever you add more highways, the commute stays 30 minutes on average, right? That the sprawl adjusts. So if you just build more highways, you don't really change the outcome. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for being here. Could you reflect on the role of the marketplace to decide versus the role of the government to mandate innovations in safety and efficiency for transportation and urban planning as it impacts transportation?
Yeah, it's, here's how we do it, and then I'll try to answer your question from a normative position. The way we do it is you say, I've got a great, smart, new idea to make vehicles safer. And then you come in and you meet with our team at NHTSA. We go and put it through the paces. And at the end of it, we either say one of three things. Yeah, you're right, this is great, go do it. No, it's not quite right, and here's why. Or we've got some questions that we need to ask you. The testing is incomplete. We need to come back and have more study on it. That's the way the system basically works. Now, our goal is to kind of do for the automobile what the Consumer Product Safety Committee does for the toys that your kids use, which is that when you buy something, you can have a confidence level that it's actually safe. I think that's the right place for us to be. It's not a desire to inhibit innovation. It's a desire to make sure that what's promised is what's delivered.
Thank you. We have all of these questions, and then we'll wrap up. So let's pick it up. Yes, ma'am.
Secretary Foxx, thank you for your emphasis on safety. I think under your leadership, we're hearing the feds talk much more about safety and transportation. And I know we're seeing at the local level, from San Francisco to New York City to Fort Lauderdale, an emphasis on the idea of Vision Zero, the goal of setting 0 traffic fatalities and severe injuries. We know that with increasing technological abilities, with design, know-how, and with policies in place, we can, if not decrease completely, decrease significantly traffic fatalities and severe injuries. What can the federal level do to support communities, again, like San Francisco to New York City, who want to really prioritize every traffic decision based on safety?
It's a great question, and we've done quite a bit, not only under my tenure, but previous Secretary Ray LaHood's tenure, to really focus on pedestrian safety. When Mayor de Blasio from New York announced his Vision Zero campaign, and we had a Tiger grant process, $600 million of basically race to the top money for transportation. We got a great application from New York City and put $25 million into helping achieve Vision Zero. So we're invested in helping communities deal with this issue. Let me say this too, that it is not just densely populated urban communities that are having a problem with pedestrian deaths and accidents. It's also in our rural communities too. And we've got to figure out solutions that address both of those areas. But you can count on us to be very sensitive to this when it comes to our discretionary grant programs, when it comes to the work that we're doing on best practices with local communities, and frankly, as it relates to how we help even transit systems get built in a way that are going to protect pedestrians as they're trying to get to those transit facilities.
I think it's true that more than 30,000 people die on America's highways every year. And there's more than 1 million people who die in cars and car-related accidents globally every year. Every one of those is a family and a terrible tragedy. Go ahead.
Hello. In your Beyond Traffic report and a number of other recent publications, we've been hearing more and more about unmanned aerial systems.
Yes.
And I'd love to get more of your thoughts about what role you think they'll play in these future multimodal transportation systems and in the smart cities of the future.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we reference unmanned aircraft systems as part of our report here, and we think it holds tremendous promise. You know, look, every year during the holiday season, my wife will sit down and she will start going online and getting stuff for folks.
It's okay. You could say she uses Google.
I was having so much trouble saying it. No, look.
We're among friends.
We're among friends. Look, and you know, look, and on some level, you say, gosh, you know, I saved a trip. I didn't go to the mall. I didn't go to the store and actually look at this stuff. I just bought it online, so what a great thing I'm doing for the environment. But, you know, whatever you bought has to get to you somehow. And so that stuff is moving, and we're still trying to understand the impacts of e-commerce on the overall impact on miles traveled in the system. What something like UAS introduces is a way to deal with the fact that a trip is still happening today on the roadways. And if they're able to create another platform to make that trip happen,
It's
there are
one less.
implications. Right?
It
Absolutely.
really does have an impact on
Yeah.
infrastructure.
So, we see the value of that, and we're working through our regulatory system to try to achieve the promise of UAS.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you.
So with self-driving cars, you will have like fewer accidents, but there will be accidents. And in some cases, when an accident is inevitable, how are you going to decide how that accident is going to happen? Like, say you have the option of crashing into a mother with a child or a teenager or a pensioner on his bike. How is the car going to decide who it's going to crash into? And will that be undefined behavior, or will that be regulated, or who is going to be liable? Can you talk about this?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I think hopefully we can find ways to limit, maybe even eliminate those situations you're describing. But that's a conversation that the public and private sector are going to have together about how we work on those things. That's one of the reasons why there is an organization like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to help advise the innovator on how to deal with those types of problems. The other thing that I would say is that, and we were talking about this earlier, one of the challenges of automated vehicles is that they actually follow the rules of the road.
This is known as that they don't speed.
And
No, but it's a good question,
Yeah.
right? So in California, right, it's well known, right, that there are plenty of times in the right lane where in fact you're going faster than the speed limit, and it's considered safe to go with the flow of other traffic, right?
right.
So what do we do?
Yeah, well, it's a question. I think it's one that we're going to have to address.
Can you imagine
together.
the highway patrol pulling over the self-driving car?
That is really blowing my mind right now, Eric.
Okay, go ahead.
Given that different agencies are responsible for different modes at different levels of jurisdiction, is there a mode split that this vision document has in mind, sort of broadly speaking, so that, the federal agencies can sort of nudge the different state and local level agencies towards towards that mode share? Or do you see this effort to be a compilation of best practices wherever federal agencies can't?
The document is really focused on breaking open a conversation we need to have as a country. Holding our system up and letting folks see it from the inside out, and beginning the conversation about whether this is the way we're going to move into the future. My own personal belief is that this system has served us incredibly well across the board. It's really, across the board, one of the finest systems, if not the finest system the world's ever known. But we've got to take better care of what we have. We've got to create new capacity where we need it, and we need it to be smarter so that we're using every bit of space and ingenuity that we have. But the way to do that, I think, is going to be creating greater coordination among these entities. I don't think we're going to be able to unring the bell, so to speak, on the state's work on the highway system, or local communities on transit, or the federal rail administration, which is largely a private, the railroads are basically private systems. I don't know that that's going to necessarily change, but I think what can change is having all of those entities working more closely together in a more fully integrated and seamless system so that we can advance mobility in the 21st century.
So since we're among friends, could you tell us a story about a negotiation with Congress or opposition or whatever that left you completely shocked and in disbelief?
Shocked and in disbelief. Well, I'll tell you, this time last year, we started putting out a highway trust fund ticker. And this was literally like a clock that was going backwards in time towards the point at which we would run out of money, because we were facing the same cliff last year that we're facing in the next 4 months. And I spent a lot of time going around Congress and talking about the need for a long-term bill and everything. And on the eve of running out of money Congress passed a 10-month extension. Now, this is the 32nd short-term extension we've had in the last 6 years.
My God. Really?
Yes. And so think about this. Think about if you're a state Department of Transportation, you've got big projects you want to do that take 2, 3, 4 years, and you've got 10 months of funding. The problem we have is that the country has really slowed down its planning process, which is slowing down the ability to get these projects done, which is affecting jobs, travel times, and everything else.
Yeah.
That's pretty shocking.
I remember there's an FAA control tower that needed to be upgraded. There was they would not pay the FAA reauthorization. They had to shut down half the FAA. Then they had to rebuild the tower, and it cost twice as much. Right? It was crazy. Complete waste of citizens' money. Yes, ma'am.
So, sort of related to the whole idea of more collaboration between the modes, how are you going to fund that for research and data across modes? Because I know that that's a huge problem. It's hard enough to fund infrastructure. It's even more difficult to fund research and the infrastructure needed to conduct all of the operations.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this because in the president's budget today, you'll be happy to know that there was $145 million dedicated to the study of automated vehicles. And that's a specific line item in the president's budget. More generally, we do believe in research. We work with a number of universities across the country on a wide variety of issues. We have studies that are going on with universities on the use of biofuels in aviation. We're looking at connected vehicle technologies, automated vehicles, any number of things. Frankly, the percentage of GDP in transportation research, as our plan shows, has decreased from about 0.7% of GDP down to 0.01, I think it is. And so we've gone down in terms of research dollars, but we're still very bullish because we've seen the results of that innovation, including the work on the automated vehicle.
And you have the honor of the last question.
Great.
With regards to the small UAS rule, I'm sure we can agree that an operation over a populous area or over a private farm area, as well as the size, weight, and kinetic energy of a vehicle, drastically changes the risk profile. What are your thoughts on taking this risk-based approach to regulation as other countries have?
We're working through our own process for creating the footprint for the innovation. But the good news is that we have been working on this for a while, and I think it's coming. It's coming sooner than you know.
There's a precedent that when you change the GPS approaches, you do something called RNP, which is the rule about how accurate the receiver of the airplane is. In other words, whatever receiver you have then determines what your rules are. So it was about the object, not some blanket rule, right? And that's, I think, the right direction, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I think for all of you, Google has many, many initiatives in transportation. We care an awful lot about things in the air and obviously all the transportation issues. There are many, and our course employees have many comments as well. It is unprecedented, Mr. Secretary, for you to bring your entire team here, right, to talk to us, to see what we're doing as a show of, I think, support for American innovation. And frankly, I think to our audience, this is why the President made the right choice in putting my friend in as Secretary of Transportation. And I think you're clearly going to be a great, great leader for America for many years to come. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.